December 22nd, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. The temperature is -20. The forest floor is frozen solid. Men who lie still for more than a few minutes begin to die. An officer in a German uniform approaches the American line under a white flag. He is carrying a formal document. It demands surrender. It promises annihilation if the demand is refused. The American commander reads it. His staff watches him. These are trained men. They understand the mathematics of what surrounds them. 5 German divisions, armor, artillery, an encirclement so complete that no supply line exists. No reinforcement is coming. The ammunition is almost gone. The wounded are dying in the cold because there are no medical supplies left to give them. His staff waits. The commander looks up from the paper and says one word: nuts. His staff asks what he wants to put in the written reply. He says to use that, just that. The formal American response, delivered to the SS officer waiting outside under his white flag, read as follows. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. The German officers who received it asked the American who delivered it what the word meant. He told them it was the equivalent of go to hell. They carried the message back through the snow to General von Lüttwitz, who commanded 5 divisions, and had just been told, in one syllable, by a man with no ammunition and no way out, that the answer was no. The SS divisions began to attack. What happened next is not a story about heroism the way Hollywood tells it. It is something quieter and more disturbing. 15,000 American men, surrounded, freezing, almost out of everything, chose to stay. The question is not whether they were brave. The question is what the Germans, professional soldiers with years of war behind them, wrote about those men afterward. Because what they wrote was not tactical analysis. It was something closer to confession. The SS had fought on the Eastern Front. They had held lines at Kursk. They had seen everything that war could show a man. Nothing had prepared them for this. To understand what broke at Bastogne, you must first understand what the Germans believed they had built. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's plan was not complicated. It was audacious. Punch through the Ardennes, drive northwest to Antwerp, split the Allied armies in 2, force a negotiated peace before the Soviet Union consumed what remained of Germany from the east. The Ardennes sector was chosen for a reason. It was thinly held. The terrain was difficult. The weather was forecast to be bad enough to ground Allied air power. And the Germans had done it before. In 1940, they had come through these same forests and broken France in 6 weeks. The plan depended on 3 things: speed, shock, and the assumption that American soldiers, when hit hard enough, would do what soldiers have done throughout the history of warfare. They would give ground. This was not arrogance without evidence. The SS divisions assigned to the breakthrough were not ordinary formations. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard. These were units that had fought at Kharkov, at Kursk, in Normandy. Their officer corps averaged 3 years of continuous combat experience. They had broken Soviet lines. They had held against British assault. They understood at a cellular level what overwhelming force did to human beings in defensive positions. And in the first 48 hours, the plan worked. German armor tore through American lines with devastating force. Entire units were overrun. The fog of war was total. American soldiers who had been resting, refitting, sleeping, suddenly found themselves retreating through the dark with tanks behind them, and no orders coming through. The system was functioning exactly as designed. This was not just an offensive. It was a layered system. Armor at the front, infantry to consolidate, artillery to suppress, and behind all of it, the psychological weight of the SS. The knowledge shared by every soldier on both sides that these were the men who did not stop. The Ardennes was a choke point. Bastogne sat at its center. 7 roads converged there. Whoever held Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. Von Lüttwitz knew this. His orders were to take it fast, or bypass it, and let a containment force handle it. He chose containment. He surrounded the town. He sent the ultimatum. He expected the mathematics to do the rest. Ammunition, temperature, hunger, time. Every system has a logic. The logic here was simple. Men cannot hold what they cannot supply. Men cannot fight what they cannot feel their hands to aim at. Men cannot choose to stay, when staying means dying slowly in a frozen hole with nothing left to shoot. The system was enormous, but every system has a seam. The seam at Bastogne was not a flaw in the German plan, it was a flaw in the German assumption. They had built their calculations around what soldiers do. They had not accounted for soldiers who had been systematically trained to stop being that. The 101st Airborne Division was not supposed to be at Bastogne. They were in Reims, France, resting, refitting, coming off Market Garden in the Netherlands, a campaign that had pushed them past what most military planners would consider survivable. They needed weeks. They needed resupply. They needed sleep. They got 18 hours. On December 17th, the order came down. The paratroopers climbed into open trucks in the dark. Most had no winter gear. The temperature was already dropping below zero. Men sat in their standard field uniforms in open vehicles, some without gloves, some without proper boots, driving northeast through the Belgian night toward the sound of a battle that was already going badly. And as they drove, they passed American soldiers coming the other way, combat veterans, men who had been in the fight. Men with that specific look that soldiers get when they have seen the thing coming and decided the mathematics don't work. Those men shouted warnings from the roadside. They said the Germans had tanks. They said the SS was coming. They said it was over. The screaming eagles listened and kept driving toward the guns. What they inherited when they arrived was this: a perimeter roughly 50 kilometers in circumference, approximately 15,000 men, many of them support troops, clerks, cooks, drivers, not frontline infantry. Limited ammunition, almost no artillery shells, inadequate medical supplies, no winter clothing, minus 20 degrees Celsius, the forest floor frozen to the hardness of concrete, wounded men dying from exposure because the aid stations had nothing left. And outside that perimeter, 5 German divisions. The encirclement closed on December 21st. What happened inside that ring over the following days is where the story becomes something that professional soldiers, men who had spent years learning the language of war, found themselves unable to adequately describe. Sergeant Leighton Black was 22 years old, Harlan County, Kentucky, a combat medic with the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. On the night of December 23rd, his aid station came under direct SS assault. The Germans were attempting to overrun a position that held wounded men who could not be moved. Black had a pistol and a carbine he had taken from a soldier too badly hurt to use it. He held the entrance to that aid station for 40 minutes, alone. When reinforcements arrived, they found 3 dead German soldiers at the threshold. They found Black still standing, a bayonet wound in his left arm that he had not reported, had not stopped to report, had not had time to report. His commanding officer recommended him for the Silver Star. Black said, in the manner of men from Harlan County, that he had been too busy to leave. Private First Class Vernon Horde, Columbus, Ohio. Machine gunner, 327th Glider Infantry. Christmas Eve. A Panzer IV came out of the dark. 40 tons of steel moving through frozen trees. Horde's machine gun could not penetrate tank armor. Every soldier knew this. When a tank comes for a machine gun position, doctrine gives you two options: relocate or stay. Horde stayed. He fired on the infantry behind the tank, breaking the assault's cohesion, buying seconds for a bazooka team to reposition. The tank's main gun fired twice in his direction. The second round threw him several meters through the air. He got up. He found his gun. He kept firing. Years later, asked why he hadn't retreated when the tank came, Horde said something that has the ring of complete simplicity and complete truth. That was my gun. Those were my guys. What else was I going to do? Not a heroic statement, the statement of a man who had reorganized his priorities so completely that leaving had ceased to exist as an option in his mind. He wasn't being brave in the way we use that word when we want to make courage sound like a gift. He had made a decision before the tank came. The Germans encountered this again and again. Not one man making a dramatic stand. An entire division of men who had each, individually, made that same prior decision. From that moment forward, there was no quiet way back, for either side. The Germans were not stupid. They were not inexperienced. They were not poorly led. They were not fighting with inferior equipment or inferior men. What they were doing, after the first assaults failed, was recalibrating. Professional soldiers recalibrate. That is what separates trained formations from mobs. When the first approach doesn't work, you analyze, you adjust. You apply more force in a different configuration. Von Lüttwitz adjusted. The attacks that followed the rejected ultimatum were not probing operations. They were full-scale assaults with coordinated armor and infantry designed to crack specific points in the American perimeter, find the seam, and pour through it before the defenders could respond. The Germans had done this before. At Kharkov, at Kursk, in France. You find the weak point. You hit it with everything. You move fast enough that the defense cannot redistribute. It works because defenders are human. Humans feel pressure accumulate. Humans feel the moment when holding becomes more expensive than yielding. Humans make the rational calculation and give ground. The system was tightening. Artillery, armor, infantry, cold, hunger, darkness. Filed, reinforced, authorized. Every variable that military doctrine says determines the outcome of an engagement was moving in the German direction. Major Herbert Bucks, a Wehrmacht operations officer attached to the siege force, wrote in his after-action report with the precision of a man trying to explain something to superiors who are not going to believe him. The American parachutists defended every position as though retreat had been struck from their vocabulary. We took ground only at costs that made the ground worthless. Read that sentence carefully. He is not writing sentiment, he is writing a logistics problem. The ground they were taking was costing more men than the ground was worth. Which meant the equation that was supposed to make the siege work, apply enough pressure and the math forces surrender, was not functioning. SS Untersturmführer Klaus Rademacher survived an engagement on December 23rd in which his unit lost 2 tanks and failed to take an American position held by approximately 80 men. He wrote to his family from a field hospital. They are not fighting from a foxhole. They are fighting from inside themselves. There is something wrong with them, something that makes them more dangerous than any soldier I have encountered. A young SS officer, trained from adolescence in the doctrine of Aryan military superiority, writing home to say that something was wrong with the Americans. Not tactically wrong, wrong in some category he did not have precise language for. Christmas Day, December 25th, 1944. Minus 22 degrees Celsius inside the Bastogne perimeter. The men of the 101st had been fighting continuously for more than 8 days, ammunition critically low, wounded men receiving field dressings and nothing else, because nothing else existed. Men whose feet had frozen inside their boots, men who had not slept in days. The Germans attacked before dawn, 5 SS divisions, coordinated, full commitment. The assault achieved a penetration. German tanks actually entered the village of Champs on the western edge of the perimeter. The fighting became room to room, building to building. American soldiers who had been in frozen holes for 8 days fought through streets with rifles and grenades, and in several documented cases with entrenching tools, with shovels, against tanks. Obersturmführer Hans Mengers, a tank commander with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, wrote in his logbook on the afternoon of December 25th, "We gained 300 meters this morning. We lost 47 men taking them. The Americans recaptured the meters by nightfall. I have no words for what these men are. 300 meters, 47 men, gone by nightfall." A tank commander with years of Eastern Front experience, sitting in his vehicle on Christmas Day, writing that he had no words. That is not a man describing an enemy. That is a man describing something that has exceeded his existing categories. The system was doing everything the system was designed to do. More pressure, more coordination, more force. And the line was not moving. What the Germans were encountering was not a defensive position. It was a decision. 15,000 individual decisions made separately, held collectively, that this ground was not going to be given. The SS had a word for positions that were held past the point of rational military logic. They called it Amerikanisch verteidigt, defended like an American. They had coined the phrase as a condescension. By Christmas night in the Ardennes, the men who used it were no longer sure it was one. The system was tightening, but the breach had already begun, not in the perimeter, in the assumption. When the war ended, the Americans collected the documents, field reports, after-action analyses, personal journals, tactical assessments written by German officers in the weeks and months following the Ardennes campaign. The collection regarding the 101st Airborne was larger and more emphatic than anything gathered regarding any other American formation in the European theater. What those documents contain is not what you expect from professional military records. Professional military records are precise. They deal in unit designations, grid coordinates, casualty figures, ammunition expenditure, time on objective. They are written in the flat language of men who have trained themselves to describe terrible things without adjectives. The documents about Bastogne are different. Again and again, German officers trained in that same flat professional language found themselves reaching for something else. Something closer to the vocabulary of men trying to describe an experience that their training had not equipped them to categorize. Obersturmbannführer Otto Dinser was a senior staff officer with the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. Das Reich had fought in France in 1940, in the Soviet Union for 3 consecutive years, at Kursk. Its officer corps had seen everything that industrialized warfare could produce. Dinser wrote a formal tactical assessment in January of 1945. It was captured by Allied forces and later analyzed by the United States Army War College. The document does not focus on American material superiority. It does not discuss Allied air power or ammunition supply, or the arrival of Patton's Third Army on December 26th. It focuses on what Dinzer called psychologische Immovabilität, psychological immovability. He writes that the American paratroopers demonstrated a capacity for holding defensive positions that exceeded anything observed in Soviet, British, or other American units. He attributes this not to training, not to equipment, not to leadership in the conventional sense. He attributes it to what he describes as a fundamentally different relationship between the individual soldier and the concept of retreat. He writes, "The American parachute soldier appears to have been conditioned to treat the abandonment of a position as a form of personal failure rather than a tactical option. This creates defensive cohesion that is nearly impossible to break through conventional assault methods." Read that again. An SS officer writing a serious tactical document, telling his superiors that the reason 5 divisions with armor and artillery could not break 15,000 men in frozen holes came down to psychology, not firepower, not numbers, psychology. What stayed with me, reading through these documents, was not the praise. Military men praise enemies when the praise serves an explanatory purpose. What stayed with me was the confusion. These were men who believed, with the certainty of deep training and longer experience, that they understood what soldiers did under extreme pressure. And they were wrong. And they knew they were wrong. And they could not fully explain why they were wrong. SS Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Holzer commanded a company with the 12th SS Panzer Division. He had fought at Kharkov. He wrote after the battle, "In 12 months of combat on the Eastern Front, I never encountered troops who made me question whether we could win. After Bastogne, I questioned it every day." Captain Hans Vogelsang, a Wehrmacht artillery officer who supported the SS operations around Bastogne, wrote in his memoir, published in West Germany in 1958. "We had a phrase on the Eastern Front. We said a position was amerikanisch verteidigt, defended like an American, when it was held past the point of rational military logic. We did not mean it as a compliment when we coined the phrase. By the time I came home from the Ardennes, I was no longer certain it wasn't one." A phrase that began as condescension became, in the mouths of men who had survived contact with the 101st, the highest professional praise they knew how to offer. But the most devastating document in the collection does not come from a junior officer writing home from a field hospital. It does not come from a staff assessment or a tactical analysis. It comes from von Lüttwitz himself, the general who sent the ultimatum, the man with 5 divisions, the man who wrote the words "complete annihilation" and meant them. In his post-war memoirs, von Lüttwitz was asked many times why he did not take Bastogne. He wrote, "The honest answer is that we did not take it because the men defending it had decided that they would not allow it to be taken, and I had no operational response to that decision." I had no operational response to that decision. That is the most devastating sentence a military commander can write. It means, I brought everything the doctrine says should work, and it did not work, because my opponent had chosen an option that the doctrine does not account for. The doctrine accounts for courage. It accounts for stubbornness. It accounts for units that fight harder than expected and require additional force to dislodge. What the doctrine does not account for is an entire division of men who have each individually removed retreat from the list of available options, not been ordered to remove it, not been threatened into removing it, chosen to remove it. The 101st Airborne came out of the Ardennes with 19,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, missing, 19,000 men out of a force that began the siege with 15,000, the difference made up by attached units and stragglers who found their way into the perimeter and chose to stay. What they had gone through was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was an extended experiment in the absolute limit of what human beings can choose to endure. And the limit turned out to be further out than anyone had believed, including the men who found it. History recorded the siege in tactical summaries and casualty figures, but the bodies that made it happen carried the damage for the rest of their lives. And one German officer spent 17 years trying to find the right words for what he had seen. He never quite found them. Werner Kortenhaus survived the war. He was taken prisoner in April of 1945, held for 18 months in an Allied detention facility, and then released into a Germany that was trying to understand what it had become. The cities were rubble. The ideology was ash. The men who came home walked back into a country that needed them to be ordinary again, to take jobs and raise children, and not speak too much about what they had seen. Most of them complied. Kortenhaus complied for a while. But there was something from the Ardennes that he could not file away, could not reduce to an anecdote at a dinner table or a footnote in a conversation about the war. Something that continued to press against the inside of his memory with a weight that ordinary language could not discharge. In 1961, he published a memoir, privately, small print run, the kind of book that finds its readers slowly, passed between men who had been there and needed to know that someone else had noticed the same thing. The chapter on Bastogne is the longest in the book, almost 3 times the length of any other chapter. He writes about the Eastern Front with the controlled precision of a man who has processed what he saw there. He writes about France, about North Africa, about the grinding attrition of the Soviet campaigns, with the flat, professional language of a soldier who has made his peace with those experiences. Then he reaches the Ardennes, and the language changes. He writes about a specific night in December. His unit assigned to assault an American position in the forest south of Bastogne. He writes about the approach through the trees. The snow that muffled sound so completely that the assault formed up almost in silence. Dozens of men moving through frozen darkness without footsteps, without voices, without the ordinary noise of soldiers preparing to fight. He writes about that silence as though it mattered, as though the quiet before the assault was itself significant in a way he is still trying to understand 16 years later. Then the American positions opened fire. He writes, "They fired as if they had been waiting for precisely us at precisely that moment, as if they had decided before we came that they were going to stay, and they were going to hold, and they were not going to let us through. And we came at them with everything we had, and they did not let us through." I had been fighting for 4 years at that point. I had never had the experience of attacking a position and feeling, not fearing, but feeling with certainty, that the men holding it were not going to move. That feeling was new to me. I have not found adequate language for it in the years since. He pauses in the text, then writes 4 words. What those men were. Another pause. What they were, they were. That is not a sophisticated sentence. It is the kind of sentence you write when you have spent 17 years trying to say something correctly, and you have finally accepted that language is not going to do it. When all you have left is the fact of the thing, and the acknowledgement that the fact is real. Bastogne still exists. The town rebuilt itself after the war. The roads still converge there, 7 of them, exactly as they did in December of 1944. In the forest outside the town, if you walk far enough from the marked paths, you can still find depressions in the earth, shallow, roughly the width and length of a man. Foxholes, frozen into the ground 80 years ago and never entirely erased. The men who dug them were mostly in their early 20s, boys from Iowa farms and Detroit factories and fishing towns in Maine and steel mill neighborhoods in Pennsylvania. They had been taken by the army and broken down to nothing, and built back up into something the world had not quite seen before. Not physically superior soldiers, something more difficult to manufacture than that. Soldiers who, when everything went wrong, when the drop was scattered and the objective was lost and the radio was dead and the nearest friendly unit was 12 miles away and the enemy was everywhere, looked at that situation and decided it was still manageable. Decided there was still a way. Decided to keep moving forward. General William Lee, the father of American airborne forces, had described what he was building in these terms. Give me men who understand that the word surrounded simply means the enemy is now in range in all directions. It sounds like a joke. It was not a joke. It was the operational philosophy that broke 5 SS divisions in the Ardennes in the coldest December in 40 years. Vernon Horde lived until 1987. He never spoke much about Bastogne at home in Columbus. His family knew he had been there. They knew it had been bad. They did not know about the tank or the second round that threw him through the air or the gun he picked back up. They found out later, the way families always find out, from documents, from other men who had been there. Leighton Black returned to Harlan County. He worked. He raised a family. When people asked about the war, he said it had been cold, which was true, and that he had done his job, which was also true. And he did not elaborate, because men from Harlan County do not elaborate. The SS divisions that surrounded Bastogne were broken up or destroyed in the months that followed. The officers who wrote those assessments, those letters, those memoirs, scattered into the post-war world. Some were tried, some were not. Some rebuilt lives in West Germany, in Argentina, in quiet towns where no one asked too many questions. But some of them wrote. And what they wrote, when they were being honest, when they were writing for themselves rather than for tribunals or for history, kept returning to the same frozen forest, the same frozen men, the same impossibility. Von Lüttwitz outlived the war by 24 years. He gave interviews. He wrote his memoirs. He answered the question about Bastogne many times in many formats. He always gave the same answer. I had no operational response to that decision. The decision, not the firepower, not the position, not the supply line or the leadership or the terrain. The decision. 15,000 individual decisions held together in the cold by nothing more structured than the collective refusal of young men to be the one who stopped. The Germans called it psychologische Immovibilität, psychological immobility. The Americans didn't call it anything. They called themselves the 101st. And they went home. And they did not elaborate. The foxholes are still there, shallow depressions in Belgian forest floor, the exact width and length of a man. They built 5 divisions around those holes. Artillery, armor, everything the doctrine said should work. The holes didn't move. The SS came to Bastogne believing they were fighting a second-rate army. What they found was something that had decided not to die. Werner Kortenhaus spent 17 years looking for the words. He never found them. What they were, they were.